There's a moment, late at night, when the noise finally drops out of a performer's life. No applause. No orchestra warming up. No producer calling from across the room. Just the soft hum of whatever space they've chosen to sit in. For Paul Anka, that silence didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in over decades, threading itself between tours, between recordings, between the relentless forward motion of a career that began before he was old enough to fully understand what it would cost him. But long before the spotlight, before the suits and the Vegas stages and the carefully measured charm, there was a boy in Ottawa who learned early that attention could be both a gift and a kind of burden. He was born in 1941, into a family that carried its own quiet weight. His father, Andy, ran a restaurant, not a glamorous place, but one that stayed open late, a place where conversations lingered and strangers passed through. His mother, Camelia, had a steadiness to her that held the house together. They were immigrants, building something from almost nothing, and that kind of life leaves little room for softness. Paul grew up surrounded by sound, not the polished kind, but the everyday noise of survival. Plates clattering, doors opening and closing, voices raised in conversation, sometimes in frustration. There was always movement, always something to be done. And in the middle of it, a boy who seemed to notice everything. He wasn't loud. Not at first. What stood out about him wasn't confidence, but sensitivity. The way he watched people. The way he listened longer than most children his age. He picked up on tone before words, on emotion before explanation. That kind of awareness can shape a person early. It teaches you how to read a room, how to adjust, how to become what's needed. And sometimes, it teaches you how to disappear. Music didn't enter his life as a grand calling. It slipped in quietly, almost like an accident. Church choirs, school performances. Small spaces where his voice started to take shape. There was something about singing that gave him control over something he didn't yet understand. A way to hold attention without having to explain himself. But even then, it wasn't simple. The adults around him saw talent. That much was clear. But talent in a working-class immigrant family doesn't always translate into encouragement. There's a practical edge to those environments. A focus on stability, on survival. Dreams are tolerated, but only up to a point. Paul learned that early. The idea that what he loved might not be taken seriously. That it might be seen as a distraction rather than a path. So he pushed harder. Not outwardly. Not in a way that demanded attention. But internally, there was a kind of pressure building. A need to prove something, even if he couldn't yet name what it was. That pressure would follow him for the rest of his life. By his early teens, he was already trying to break out of Ottawa. Not physically at first, but creatively. Writing songs. Performing wherever he could. There's something restless about that age when ambition starts to take hold. A sense that the world is bigger than what you've been shown, and that staying still might mean missing something. For Paul, that restlessness became direction. He formed a vocal group, performed locally, and started to get a taste of what it felt like to be seen. Not just noticed, but recognized. It's a subtle difference, but it matters. Recognition feeds something deeper. It tells you that what you're doing isn't just noise. It has shape, meaning. But recognition also comes with expectation. And expectation, once it settles in, doesn't leave easily. At 14, he made his first trip to New York City. Alone. That decision says more about him than any early success story ever could. A teenager, crossing borders, carrying songs that no one had asked for, stepping into a city that had no reason to care. There's a kind of quiet defiance in that. Not rebellion for its own sake, but a refusal to stay where you are simply because it's expected. New York didn't welcome him with open arms. It rarely does. He knocked on doors, met people who barely listened, faced the kind of dismissal that doesn't come with explanation. Just a look, a polite nod, a closed door. For most people, that would have been enough. A sign to go back, to wait, to try again later. Paul didn't see it that way. Rejection, for him, wasn't a verdict. It was information. Something to be studied, adjusted for. That mindset, the ability to absorb failure without letting it define you, started to take root early, and it would become one of the defining traits of his career. But it came at a cost. Because learning to push through rejection often means learning to suppress doubt. And doubt doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It settles somewhere deeper. Quieter. It waits. Back in Ottawa, he doubled down. Writing more. Performing more. Watching the industry from a distance and trying to understand its patterns. He wasn't just chasing success. He was studying it. That's what set him apart. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. By the time he was 16, that deliberation paid off in a way that changed everything. He wrote a song, simple on the surface, but carrying something raw underneath. A kind of longing that felt older than he was. That song would eventually become Diana. But at the time, it was just another attempt. Another piece of himself put into the world, with no guarantee of what would come back. When Diana finally broke through, it didn't just succeed, it exploded. Topping charts, crossing borders, reaching audiences far beyond anything he had imagined. Overnight, the boy from Ottawa became something else. A name. A presence. But success at that age doesn't feel the way people expect it to. There's no time to process. No space to understand what's happening. One moment you're writing songs in your room, the next you're being told where to stand, what to say, how to move. The world speeds up, and you're expected to keep pace. For Paul, that transition wasn't smooth. He adapted, because that's what he had always done. But underneath the adaptation, there was a kind of disorientation. A sense that things were moving faster than he could fully grasp. That the life he had imagined was already slipping into something more complicated. Fame, especially early fame, has a way of flattening identity. People stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a version of yourself that they prefer. And the more successful that version becomes, the harder it is to step outside of it. Paul learned quickly that being Paul Anka was different from being himself. And once that distinction forms, it doesn't go away. Behind the performances, behind the polished image, there was still the boy who had grown up watching everything, measuring every interaction, trying to understand what people wanted from him. That instinct didn't disappear with success. It intensified. He became sharper, more controlled, more aware of how he was perceived. But awareness can become its own kind of trap, because when you're constantly adjusting, constantly refining the version of yourself that the world sees, it becomes harder to know where the performance ends. And at 16, he was already performing, not just on stage but in life. The industry around him didn't slow down to accommodate his age. It moved forward, expecting him to keep up. Recordings, tours, interviews, a cycle that left little room for anything resembling a normal adolescence. There were no pauses, and in those early years, something began to take shape. Not just a career, but a pattern. Work as identity, success as validation, movement as a way to avoid stillness. Because stillness, for someone like Paul, meant thinking. And thinking often led back to the same question. What happens if this stops? That question doesn't disappear once it's asked. It lingers, even in moments of success. Especially in moments of success. By the end of his teenage years, Paul Anka wasn't just a rising star. He was established, recognized, expected. But beneath that, there was still something unsettled. Because the story people saw, the overnight success, the young prodigy, wasn't the full story. It never is. What they didn't see was the accumulation of small moments, the quiet doubts, the constant recalibration, the sense that everything he had built could shift at any time. And that sense would stay with him. Not as fear exactly, more like awareness. The kind that doesn't let you relax completely, even at the beginning. Success didn't arrive gently for Paul Anka. It came fast, and it came with expectations that didn't wait for him to catch up. After Diana, there was no reset. No moment where he could step back and understand what had just happened. The industry had already decided what he was. A teenage star with a clean image, a voice that carried longing, and a face that could sell records. That identity was handed to him almost fully formed. And once it was in place, it had to be maintained. He moved quickly into a rhythm that would define his early adulthood. Recording sessions stacked one after another. Tours that blurred cities into a single continuous stretch. Interviews that repeated the same questions with slightly different phrasing. There was a structure to it, but it wasn't one he controlled. Control in those years was something he had to fight for. What made Paul different wasn't just his voice or his timing. It was his insistence on being involved in the machinery behind his own success. He didn't want to just perform songs. He wanted to write them, shape them, own them. That wasn't the norm. The music industry at the time preferred simplicity. Artists performed. Producers decided. Writers stayed in the background. But Paul didn't fit neatly into that system. He had already tasted what it meant to create something from nothing, and he wasn't willing to give that up. So he pushed. Not loudly, not in a way that disrupted everything around him, but persistently. He negotiated. He learned the business side of music. He paid attention to contracts, royalties, publishing rights, details most artists his age never considered. That awareness gave him leverage. It also isolated him. Because when you step outside the role people expect you to play, you create distance. Producers saw him as difficult. Executives saw him as ambitious in a way that bordered on threatening. Other performers saw him as someone operating on a different level. Not just artist, but strategist. He wasn't always liked, but he was respected. That distinction mattered to him, even if he didn't say it out loud. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, he continued to produce hit after hit. Songs that carried a kind of emotional clarity. Simple structures, direct language, melodies that stayed with you. He understood something fundamental about audiences. They weren't looking for complexity. They were looking for recognition. A feeling they already had, reflected back to them. That ability made him valuable. It also made him indispensable to certain parts of the industry. But success doesn't eliminate pressure. It refines it. With each hit, the expectations grew sharper. It wasn't enough to succeed once. He had to repeat it, improve on it, stay ahead of whatever was coming next. And something was always coming next. The 1960s weren't stable. Music was shifting, faster, more aggressively than before. New sounds, new attitudes, new artists who weren't interested in the same polished image Paul had been built on. Then came the Beatles. Their arrival didn't just change the charts. It changed the structure of the industry itself. The clean-cut teen idol model started to lose its dominance. Audiences wanted something different, something less controlled, less predictable. For many artists of Paul's generation, that shift was destabilizing. Careers stalled. Relevance faded. Some disappeared entirely. Paul didn't. But surviving that shift required something more than talent. It required reinvention. He stepped away from the narrow space he had been placed in and expanded outward. Songwriting became his anchor. If he couldn't control how he was perceived as a performer, he could control what he created behind the scenes. That's where some of his most lasting work began to take shape. He wrote for other artists, stepping into their voices while maintaining his own structure underneath. One of the most defining moments came when he collaborated with Frank Sinatra on My Way. That song didn't feel like a typical commission. It felt personal, almost confrontational in its honesty. A reflection on control, on choices, on the cost of living a life shaped by your own decisions. It fit Sinatra perfectly, but it also revealed something about Paul. He understood endings. Even in the middle of his career, he was already writing about reflection, about looking back, about measuring a life against itself. That perspective doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from living at a pace where you're constantly aware that what you have could shift. My Way became more than a song. It became a kind of cultural marker, and Paul was behind it. That mattered, not just professionally but personally. It validated the part of him that had always wanted control. The writer, the observer, the one who shaped things rather than simply performing them. But control, once you have it, comes with responsibility. And responsibility over time can become heavy. His personal life began to reflect that weight. Relationships formed under the pressure of his career. Intense, fast-moving, often built around the limited time he had available. He married young, started a family, tried to create stability within a life that was anything but stable. It wasn't easy. There's a specific kind of distance that forms when your work requires constant movement. You're present, but not fully. You're there, but your attention is split between what's happening now and what's coming next. That split doesn't always show immediately, but over time it builds. His first marriage eventually ended, not with a single defining moment, but with the accumulation of smaller fractures, time apart, conflicting priorities, the quiet erosion that happens when two people are moving in different directions without realizing it. For someone who had built so much of his life on control, that kind of loss was difficult to process. Because it wasn't something he could manage the way he managed his career. There were no contracts to renegotiate, no structures to adjust. Just the reality that some things don't hold, no matter how much effort you put into them. He continued working through it. That's what he had always done. Las Vegas became a central part of his life during this period. Not as an escape, but as a controlled environment. A place where the expectations were clear, the structure was stable, and the audience came specifically to see him. On those stages, he had something close to control again. Night after night, the same setting, the same rhythm, the same exchange between performer and audience. It allowed him to refine his presence, to adjust in real time, to maintain a version of himself that felt consistent. But even consistency can become isolating. Because repetition, over time, removes unpredictability. And unpredictability, despite its risks, is often what makes things feel alive. Behind the scenes, the industry continued to shift. New genres, new technologies, new ways of consuming music. The pace didn't slow down. It accelerated. Paul adapted where he could. He leaned further into writing, into production, into the parts of the industry that weren't as visible but carried more longevity. He understood that being in front of the audience wasn't the only way to remain relevant. That understanding kept him in the conversation long after many of his contemporaries had faded. But staying relevant isn't the same as staying fulfilled. That distinction became more noticeable as the years went on. He had success. He had influence. He had a catalog of work that spanned decades. But there were moments, quieter ones, less visible, where the question resurfaced. What is all of this for? It's not a question that demands an immediate answer. It lingers. It shifts depending on where you are, what you've lost, what you've gained. For Paul, it wasn't about regret. It was about measurement, looking at what he had built and trying to understand its weight. Not just in terms of success, but in terms of cost. Because every decision, every opportunity taken, every path chosen had required something in return. Time, energy, relationships, pieces of himself. And those pieces don't always come back. By the time he moved into his later years, there was a noticeable change in how he carried himself. Not in a dramatic way. There were no sudden transformations, but in small adjustments. A slightly slower pace. A more measured presence. The drive was still there. But it wasn't as urgent. That urgency had been replaced by something else. Awareness. The kind that comes from having lived through multiple versions of your own life. From understanding that success isn't a single moment, but a series of phases, each with its own demands. And each with its own ending. Paul Anka had navigated more of those endings than most. But there was still one he hadn't fully faced. Not yet. There's a difference between slowing down and deciding to stop. For most of his life, Paul Anka never really did either. Even as the years stacked up, 40, 50, 60 in the industry, he kept moving the same way he always had. Touring, writing, adjusting, watching the room, reading people the way he learned to do as a boy in Ottawa. But somewhere in his 80s, the rhythm changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough. A show that took more out of him than it used to. A morning where the voice didn't respond immediately. A flight that felt longer than the distance suggested. Things that no one in the audience could see. But he could. And that was enough. He never framed it as decline. That word didn't fit the way he understood his own life. Instead, he started thinking in terms of timing. I've always believed, he says quietly, almost as if he's still working it out while speaking. You don't wait for the moment to pass you. You recognize when it's changing. That awareness had followed him since he was a teenager walking into unfamiliar rooms, trying to understand what people wanted before they said it. Now, the room was different. And for the first time, it wasn't asking for more. It was asking for less. There's something difficult about that, especially for someone who built everything on momentum. Because when the movement slows, the silence comes back. And Paul had spent most of his life outrunning silence. Not consciously, but consistently. Work filled the space. Always had. Songs, deals, performances, reinvention. There was always something next. Until there wasn't. At 84, the question isn't what's next. It's what's left that still feels honest. And Paul wasn't interested in pretending. I can still go out there, he admits. I can still do the show. People would come. They'd clap. It would work. He pauses there. Not dramatically. Just long enough to let the thought settle. But that's not the point. For him, it never had been. Even in his earliest success, what mattered wasn't just performing. It was knowing what he was doing, and why. That instinct never left. So when things began to shift, not collapse, not fail, just shift, he paid attention. He noticed how much effort it took to maintain what once felt automatic. He noticed how the energy after a performance didn't return the same way. He noticed the space between moments getting wider. Not empty, just different. And somewhere in that difference, the decision started forming. Not as a single thought, but as a quiet accumulation. I don't want to stay out there just because I can, he says. I've seen what that looks like. That's not how I want this to end. He had seen it up close. Careers stretched too far. Performances that became echoes instead of expressions. The slow fading of something that once had precision. Paul's entire life had been built on control. Not rigid control, but awareness. Timing. Adjustment. Leaving would require the same thing. The strange part wasn't deciding to step away. It was understanding what stepping away meant. Because when you've been performing since you were a teenager, the stage isn't just a place. It's a structure. It tells you where to stand, what to do, how to exist in front of people. Without it, things open up. And openness isn't always comfortable. There's a part of you that wonders, he says, his voice quieter now, less certain. Who you are when you're not doing it. He doesn't rush to answer that. Maybe there isn't a clean answer. In the months leading up to his decision, the performances didn't change outwardly. The audience still saw the same presence, the same control, the same understanding of timing that had defined him for decades. But internally, something was different. He was paying closer attention. Not to the crowd, to himself. Every note carried a little more awareness. Every pause felt more intentional. Not because he was trying to make it emotional, but because he knew, whether he said it or not, that these moments weren't infinite anymore. I started noticing the details more, he says. The way the room sounds before the music starts. The way people look at you when they recognize a song. A slight shift in his tone. I didn't want to lose that by staying too long. That's the part most people misunderstand. Leaving isn't about losing the ability. It's about preserving the meaning. And Paul understood that better than most. So the decision, when it finally settled, didn't feel heavy. It felt accurate, like something aligning rather than ending. There was no need for a grand announcement. No farewell tour designed to stretch the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. That wasn't his style. Instead, he let it unfold the way his career always had, deliberately. A few less shows, longer gaps, a quiet step back that only became obvious when you looked at it as a whole. I don't think you need to make a big speech about it, he says. If people have been with you this long, they understand. And maybe they do. Or maybe they feel it before they understand it. The slight change in tone. The way a performance holds just a little more weight. The sense that something is closing, even if no one says the word. For Paul, the hardest part wasn't the audience. It was the identity. Because for decades, the two had been tied together. Paul Anka the man. Paul Anka the performer. At some point they stopped being separate. I've lived a lot of my life out there, he says, almost matter of fact. That's where people know me. That's where I've known myself. Another pause. But that doesn't mean it's the only place I exist. That realization didn't come early. It took time. Years of movement. Years of defining himself through work. And now, for the first time, he was allowing something else. Not a new career. Not a reinvention. Just space. And in that space, there's reflection. Not dramatic. Not emotional in an obvious way. Just steady. Clear. He thinks about the boy in Ottawa, the one who watched more than he spoke, the one who learned how to read a room before he ever stood in front of one. That instinct never left. It just grew. I did what I set out to do, he says. No hesitation. No need to soften it. I went where I wanted to go. I made the music I wanted to make. I stayed longer than most people get to. A small breath. That's enough. There's no regret in his voice. But there is awareness. Of time. Of cost. Of everything that came with it. He doesn't try to balance it. Doesn't list what was gained versus what was lost. Because at this stage, those calculations don't change anything. They just explain it. What matters now is simpler. I want to leave it in a place where it still feels right, he says. And that's the decision. Not driven by fear. Not forced by failure. But chosen. The stage doesn't disappear. It just stops being where he stands. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind it all. For a man who spent his entire life understanding timing, he knew exactly when to step away,